Welcome to today's captivating tale of resilience and hope. Meet Margaret Eunice Whitaker, a determined widow cast out into a merciless winter with her two young sons, struggling against frigid winds and an uncertain future. The trio stumbles across a solitary rancher whose quiet strength becomes their unexpected lifeline. But that's only the start of the drama. Margaret must soon face a powerful adversary who threatens to take her children away. How will she summon the courage to defend all she holds dear? Will this silent rancher stand firmly by her side when the battle grows fierce? Stay tuned to find out how this emotional journey unfolds. And while you're here, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share more heartwarming stories, and we'd love to have you along for every chapter. Hit that notification bell so you'll never miss a moment of inspiration. Margaret Eunice Whitaker stood at the edge of a small cemetery on the outskirts of Beckwith Fork, watching the fresh mound of dirt where her husband's coffin lay hidden from the biting winter wind. The year was 1885, and the Colorado high country had never felt so unforgiving. Ice clung to the brittle grass like shards of glass. The mountains rose like silent sentinels in the distance, and the sun offered little warmth against the chill. Margaret's cheeks were raw and stinging, both from the cold and from tears that had long since dried on her face. She was a tall woman with auburn hair, now dulled by dust, sorrow, and weeks of poor rest. 3 weeks ago, she had still been Mrs. Arthur Whitaker. But widowhood came quickly on the frontier with no regard for age or how much love had been left to give. Standing beside Margaret, huddled against her patched wool cloak, were her two young sons, Thomas and Andrew. Thomas, the older at 8, had Arthur's serious green eyes. He was tall for his age and fiercely protective of his family. Andrew, only 6, stood slightly behind his mother, his small fingers clutching the worn edge of her skirt. He had a gentle expression, his bright curiosity dulled for the moment by the gravity of losing the man they all loved. The funeral had been attended by only a handful of people, just the local preacher, a pitying neighbor or two, and of course Arthur's older brother, Zachary Whitaker, who delivered a few final words that felt as cold and distant as the wind. Less than an hour after the funeral ended, Margaret realized that her husband's family was not only uninterested in helping her, but intent on casting her out altogether. Zachary declared she had no legal standing to remain on what he called the Whitaker family land. He tossed out terms and documents she didn't understand, forging a narrative that in his eyes made Margaret an intruder. There was to be no inheritance for her or the children, no room to remain in what had been Arthur's home, and not so much as a single item beyond a few personal effects. It was both shocking and humiliating. But in her grief and confusion, Margaret found herself unable to muster more than a weak protest. She had no immediate family of her own to call upon, no money to hire a lawyer, and no knowledge of how to fight back against the Whitaker men and their sense of absolute entitlement. The day after she buried Arthur, Margaret and the boys were all but forced off the property with a single satchel of clothing, a threadbare quilt, and the minimal coins she had managed to hide away. The entire affair reeked of cruelty. Neighbors saw but said nothing. Zachary's sway in the area was strong. With her eyes set on the horizon beyond the lonely farmland, Margaret vowed she would not return to beg for charity. She clasped each boy's hand in her own, feeling the tremble of their small bodies, and thought, "We will find a way, or we will make a way." Little did she know how that vow would lead them through snow-choked roads and right into an encounter that would change all their fates forever. 2 days after leaving the Whitaker homestead, the trio trudged along a remote road cutting through the foothills. The sky, awash of pewter gray, hinted at more snow to come. Every breath Margaret exhaled formed a ghostly cloud hanging in the air before dissolving into frigid nothing. Thomas held on to her right hand, Andrew to her left, and they walked close together to share what little warmth they had left. Their boots slipped on patches of ice and slush, each step accompanied by the crunch of half-frozen gravel. The boys took turns quietly asking if there might be a town, a farm, or even a kind soul just over the next hill. Margaret responded with as much confidence as she could manage, but she truly had no idea where they were headed. Her resolve burned to keep them safe and prove to them and to herself that she was still worth believing in, even if her grief and confusion sometimes threatened to crush her spirit. Hours of cold, persistent walking brought them to a clearing where the wind cut through exposed trees like a knife. Thin flurries began swirling around them, sharp as tiny needles. Andrew coughed a rough sound that made Margaret's heart tighten. She adjusted the fraying shawl around his shoulders, wishing she had something warmer for both children. She noticed the telltale signs of numbness in Thomas's face as his lips were turning a faint shade of purple. Yet he stubbornly refused to complain. Just when Margaret considered veering off the path to find shelter under some pines, she heard the muffled echo of hoofbeats in the distance. She stopped, urging the boys to stay near. Through the swirling curtain of snow, a figure on horseback emerged, tall in the saddle posture. Straight, despite the icy gusts, as he drew closer, Margaret caught sight of his weathered coat dusted white from the snow and a broad-brimmed hat pulled low, though not low enough to hide eyes that seemed alert but calm. He guided his horse slowly, showing no threat or rush. Margaret took a protective step forward, shielding her boys behind her. She had heard stories of drifters, rustlers, and worse out on these lonely roads. But something about this stranger's relaxed demeanor eased her tension just enough. He tipped his hat politely. "Afternoon," he said, voice carrying in the hush. "Name's Silas Redwood. You folks caught out in this weather on purpose." His tone wasn't mocking, just filled with quiet curiosity. Margaret hesitated, measuring her words. "We're traveling," she said simply, her voice hoarse. Looking for a place to rest, Silas nodded his gaze, flicking momentarily to Thomas and Andrew, then back to Margaret. "I've got a ranch, a short ride west, just over that ridge. If you need to warm up and wait out the storm, you're welcome there." He didn't push or plead, it was simply an offer. Margaret read the sincerity in his face. She cast a glance at her children. Thomas was shivering in earnest now, and Andrew's cough was too persistent to ignore. Pride wouldn't feed or warm them, and her trust was drawn by Silas's steady composure. She drew a shaky breath. "We'd be grateful," she finally replied, her fingers tightening around the boy's hands. Silas's ranch sat nestled at the base of a low forested slope where tall pines stood like silent guardians. The main house was constructed of sturdy logs fitted tight to keep out the worst of winter. A stone chimney jutted from the side, emitting a thin curl of smoke that promised warmth and possibly a hot meal. Alongside the house sprawled a modest barn, its roof piled with snow and a small tool shed that leaned slightly from years of uneven ground. The yard displayed a scattering of half-buried fence rails, a water trough coated with a thin layer of ice, and footprints from Silas's comings and goings. Margaret could hardly restrain the wave of relief that washed over her when Silas helped them inside. The interior of the ranch house was surprisingly neat, if sparse. A rough-hewn wooden table with 2 chairs took up space near the fireplace, while a narrow bed frame stood near the far wall covered in a patchwork quilt. On a shelf above the hearth, Margaret spotted a half-dozen books, an unusual sight in these parts, and a single photograph in a plain frame, its details faded. She couldn't quite make out the faces, but it looked like a woman and a small boy. Silas never turned to glance at it. His focus was on Margaret and her sons, who were stamping their feet to rid themselves of the cold. "Sit by the fire," Silas said. "I'll get water heating so you can wash up. Then I'll rustle up some supper." His voice was low and steady, carrying neither judgment nor pity. He moved about the room with the quiet assurance of a man used to living alone, but who was not entirely unaccustomed to caring for others. While the boys peeled off their damp coats, Margaret took stock of her surroundings, heart still pounding with a mix of uncertainty and gratitude. She noticed Silas was lean as hair, a dark gold, that might have once been lighter before sun and dust dulled it. Deep lines etched the corners of his eyes, hinting at years spent under an unrelenting sun, or perhaps experiences that weighed heavily on a man's soul. Every movement he made was measured and efficient, as though too many words or gestures would be wasted. "Energy, I appreciate this," Margaret murmured after a few moments once she found her voice again. "We don't have much to offer, but if there's a way to repay your kindness—" She trailed off, uncertain how to finish. She wasn't naive enough to think that all men offered charity without expecting something in return, yet her instincts told her Silas was different. His ranch, while simple, looked well-maintained. Clearly he was not desperate. Silas put a cast-iron pot of water on the hearth to warm, then glanced up. "Don't think of it as a debt," he said softly. "No sense letting people freeze out there when I've got extra room. You can stay as long as you need to figure out where you're heading next. We'll talk about chores or anything else later." When he turned back to the hearth, Margaret's gaze lingered on him. Something about his voice made her chest tighten, a subtle reassurance she hadn't felt in a long time. She glanced at Thomas and Andrew settling by the fire, their cheeks reddening from the sudden warmth. They looked to her for confirmation, a silent question in their eyes. Is this man safe? Is this truly a place of refuge? Margaret gave them the smallest nod and tried to relax, if only a little. For the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of hope that maybe the world still held corners of kindness. Over a supper of hot stew laced with carrots and chunks of venison, Margaret and the boys learned a little of Silas Redwood's life. He spoke in measured sentences, carefully choosing what he offered. The ranch, he explained, had belonged to his parents, but only he remained. He never elaborated on what had happened to them, nor did Margaret pry grief. Recognize grief, and she knew that certain sorrows were best respected with silence. Thomas and Andrew devoured the stew. Their appetite was fierce after so many cold days of minimal rations, and Silas refilled their bowls without a word. Margaret ate more slowly, noticing her own hunger only after the first few bites. Her body finally registering the warmth of both the food and the fire. She felt a weight drop from her shoulders. She looked around to see Andrew's eyelids drooping as the heat lulled him towards sleep, and Thomas fighting to stay awake, determined to appear grown in front of this stranger who had shown them unexpected kindness. After supper, Silas showed them to a small room off the main living area. It appeared more like a storage space with a few crates stacked in corners and an extra saddle resting on the floor. Yet there was a spare cot, and he brought in a pile of quilts to build a makeshift bed for all three of them. "If they squeeze together, I'll bed down near the fire," Silas said simply, hooking a lantern on a nail near the door, in case the wind picks up and needs tending. That night, Margaret curled up with her sons. The sensation of lying on something other than hard ground was a relief. As Andrew nestled against her, she felt his tiny hand grip hers, a gesture that spoke volumes about how uncertain he felt in this new place. Despite the warmth and the kindness, she whispered a lullaby, one she used to sing back at the old homestead when Arthur was alive. Her voice wavered with emotion. She half expected to be overwhelmed by grief, but something about Silas's quiet presence in the other room grounded her. "We can get through another day," she told herself. "We're still together." In the early hours before dawn, when the sky was just beginning to lighten to a bluish haze through the frost-rimmed window, Margaret awoke to hear Silas adding logs to the fireplace. The soft crackle of wood and the glow of embers gave her a moment to watch him unseen. He moved almost reverently, careful not to stir the boys. A faint memory rose in her mind of Arthur doing much the same in their own small cabin on colder nights. She swallowed against the ache that memory brought, reminding herself this was a new morning in a place that so far had refused to turn them away. As day broke, she helped rouse the boys and fold blankets, while Silas ladled out thin but nourishing oatmeal for breakfast. The snow had stopped sometime in the night, leaving behind a glittering white landscape. "You're welcome to stay a while," Silas offered, "until you figure out your next stop." Margaret, feeling the enormity of the outside world pressing on her, nodded. She didn't know what she might do in the long run, but for that day, for that moment, it seemed wise to remain where the door had not been slammed in her face. Over the following week, Margaret began to find her footing in Silas Redwood's ranch house. What initially seemed like a temporary refuge became a place where she could contribute. She insisted on doing laundry and cleaning the modest living space. Tasks Silas accepted with a nod rather than protest. She noticed how his belongings were neatly stored, how he kept a small ledger of expenses on the table, and how the barn was meticulously organized. Yet she also saw how the floor had gone unswept for days at a time, how the dishes piled up, and how a few dusty corners suggested that maybe he'd given up on certain chores in the quiet resignation of living alone. For their part, Thomas and Andrew became small shadows trailing Silas outside. The ranch offered new wonders for them, a pair of docile horses, a coop full of clucking hens that needed feeding, and a water pump near the barn that they found endlessly fascinating. Silas, to Margaret's surprise, seemed patient with all their questions. Thomas wanted to know how to throw a lasso, and Andrew asked why the big iron plow was shaped the way it was. Silas answered each query in a calm, straightforward manner, as though he were talking to fellow ranchers instead of two small, wide-eyed boys. Margaret observed Silas showing Thomas how to secure the clasp on a horse's bridle, step by step, praising him quietly when he did it right. She watched him help Andrew gather eggs, demonstrating how to coax a hen aside without startling it. These were small acts of mentorship, but Margaret felt them in her heart, like the warmth of a hearth after a cold day. A memory bubbled up from her childhood. Her own father had died when she was only 9, and she never had someone to show her the ropes of everyday life in such a patient manner. Perhaps that's why this moment feels so raw and meaningful, she mused. During those early mornings while the boys followed Silas, Margaret found ways to help around the house. She'd boil water for washing dishes, mend shirts, and experiment with the sparse pantry ingredients to create hearty meals. She didn't want to overstep, but Silas never told her to stop. He would simply nod and occasionally comment that the stew tastes real good or that the clothes on the line smelled like fresh air. He was a man of few words, but each one was sincere. It was a refreshing change from the cold brutality of Zachary Whitaker's dismissals. No one belittled her here, and no one told her she wasn't wanted. Still, a shadow of anxiety lingered. She kept expecting a knock on the door or a rider appearing on the horizon, someone sent by Zachary to fetch her back or to demand the boys. The memory of their final cold exchange replayed in her mind. He had claimed to have legal rights over the land, the inheritance, even the children if he so chose. That threat had never fully dissolved in her mind. One evening she asked Silas, "What if someone from my husband's family tries to come for us?" He paused in the act of drying a plate, setting it down slowly. "Then they'll have to go through me first," he replied matter-of-factly. No anger or bravado in his tone. His answer settled in Margaret's chest, stirring a mixture of relief and guilt. She didn't want him taking on her burdens, but it was clear he would not have it any other way. Whether this was the first flicker of deeper feeling, Margaret couldn't be certain. She only knew that in the quiet hush of the ranch, with the fire snapping and the boys reading a weathered book on the floor, she felt safer than she had in many months. And that sense of safety was a rare coin she didn't intend to squander. Margaret's sense of foreboding arrived in physical form a fortnight after they settled at the ranch. The knock on the door came in the late afternoon, a sharp rapping that shattered the peaceful routine. Silas had been outside fixing a broken fence post with Thomas, while Andrew napped under a quilt. Margaret felt her heart lurch at the sound. She pressed a hand to her chest, steeling herself. "It's probably a traveler like we once were," she tried to assure herself, but a deeper instinct told her otherwise. She opened the door to find two men standing on the small wooden porch. One wore a deputy's star pinned to his vest, and his companion, a heavy-set fellow in a fine wool coat, looked altogether too satisfied with himself. They greeted her curtly, then asked if the ranch owner was about. Silas appeared momentarily from the barn, having heard the voices. He approached calmly, though Margaret noticed a tension in his shoulders. "I'm Deputy Sampson, the lean man with the star," said. "We received a message from the Whitaker family. They claim a woman named Margaret Whitaker, widow of Arthur, ran off with two minors, leaving behind confusion over inheritance and guardianship." He glanced at the paper he held, clearly uncomfortable. "By law, we have an obligation to check the welfare of the children and, if necessary, return them to their nearest living relative, if conditions are found unsuitable." Margaret's jaw tightened. She suspected Zachary's hand behind this, twisting the law to suit his narrative. She reached for Andrew's shoulder, instinctively pulling him closer. Thomas, trailing behind Silas, stood by the fence line, an uncertain mix of concern and defiance flickering in his eyes. "He's only 8, Margaret thought desperately. "He shouldn't have to see us threatened like this." Silas, in posture, rigid, didn't raise his voice. "The children are safe here," he said. "They aren't neglected or harmed. They're free to speak for themselves if that's needed." The deputy looked conflicted, as though he'd hoped for a more cut-and-dry situation. The heavy-set man, however, sneered. "Safe, perhaps, but is this your property, sir? Or are you simply harboring runaways?" Margaret's cheeks burned. "We didn't run away. We were left with nothing. My husband's family took everything despite Arthur's wishes, and we had no choice but to leave." She tried to keep her voice steady, but a tremor betrayed her indignation. The deputy cleared his throat. "All due respect, ma'am, that's not what the Whitakers are saying. The official complaint states that you're mentally unfit due to grief and that your husband's brother is worried for the children's well-being. We're just here to verify his words, though." Softer felt like iron nails. Margaret opened her mouth to protest, but Silas's steady hand on her arm stopped her. "You've verified," Silas said quietly. "The kids are clothed, fed, and warm. There's no sign of unfitness here. If the brother wants to press the matter, he can do so in court, but he'll need to prove it." The heavy-set man's sneer twisted into annoyance. "We'll see about that," he spat. "Expect an official notice. We'll be back with the proper paperwork." Margaret stared, blood pounding in her ears. She felt the sting of tears in her eyes. Not of sadness, but of simmering rage. As the two men rode away, leaving swirling snow kicked up by their horses, Silas closed the door gently. The boys looked up at him, uncertain. Exhaled slowly. "We won't let them take you," he promised in that firm, steady voice. Somehow hearing that assurance from him held back the tears that threatened. It wasn't just a promise to her, it was also a promise to Thomas and Andrew, and Margaret believed him. Time took on a tense quality. After that ominous visit, Margaret carried out her daily tasks, cooking, cleaning, and trying to give the boys a semblance of normalcy. but every distant hoofbeat or stray rider on the ridge made her pulse race. Silas, always a man of few words, grew even quieter and more watchful. He'd walk the fence line at dawn, rifle slung across his back, checking for any sign of intruders or trouble. Thomas and Andrew noticed the change, though they lacked the vocabulary to describe their unease. Sometimes Margaret would overhear Thomas whispering to Andrew at night, "They won't take us. Andy, I won't let them," and her heart would clench. A week later, their anxieties crystallized into reality when a courier delivered a letter bearing the county courthouse seal. Silas found it tucked into his saddlebag while fetching supplies in a nearby settlement. He handed it to Margaret without a word, and she opened it with trembling hands as she read the formal demands inside, accusing her of neglect, announcing a guardianship hearing brought by Zachary Whitaker. She felt her stomach lurch. The papers cited official statutes, threatened legal consequences, and demanded that the children be brought to the hearing for a judge to decide who should have custody over them. Margaret read each line twice, hardly absorbing the legal jargon. She recognized enough words to understand the gravity of the threat. If she did not appear in court, the judge might rule in favor of Zachary by default. If she did appear, Zachary's word could hold more power than her own, given the man's local influence. "He has the money," she murmured, voice shaking. "He has the resources. I don't even know where to start." Silas's expression hardened as he read over her shoulder. "Then we start by not letting him take what isn't his." He walked to a trunk near the foot of his bed and removed a worn leather folder, pulling out a few papers. "Military discharge," he explained succinctly, showing it to her, "and a few references from folks I served with. They might not have much bearing in family court, but I won't just stand by while that man tries to tear you from your boys." Margaret stared down at the discharge papers in wonder. He was a soldier. She glimpsed the words honorable and injury sustained, her eyes darting over each line. The realization that Silas carried wounds from a past conflict only deepened her respect for him. He had never boasted or shared war stories. He just quietly bore the scars. Like me, she thought. That night they made plans. They decided not to flee. Running would only confirm Zachary's suspicions, and Margaret didn't want her children growing up on the run, forever looking over their shoulders. Silas offered to accompany her to the hearing. "No matter what happens, at least we speak our truth," he said. "I've seen men with all the money in the world crumble when confronted with honesty." Margaret would have laughed at such optimism had her fear not been so real. Still, she felt a growing flame of determination. For Thomas and Andrew, she had to stand and fight. If there was a way to prove that Zachary's claims were false, if there was a path to a stable future here with Silas, she would seize it. And so, with hearts beating in unison, Margaret's in dread, Silas's in steeled resolve, they began to prepare for the fight that loomed just a few days away. They departed for the county seat at dawn. 2 days before the hearing date specified in the letter, Silas packed up a sturdy horse named Birch for Margaret's use while he rode a gelding named Tucker. They debated bringing the boys along immediately, but decided the ride and lodging would be harsh on them. Instead, Silas convinced an older woman in town, Mrs. Rose Mallory, the local baker, with a kindly spirit to look after Thomas and Andrew for those few days. Margaret was reluctant to part with her children, but the presence of a stable environment and sweet rolls on offer gave her some peace of mind. The journey to the county seat, a small hub called Willcrest, would take the better part of 2 days through winding mountain roads. Snow still clung to the higher passes, melting into muddy ruts in lower areas. Riding alongside Silas, Margaret tried to keep her nerves at bay by focusing on the surroundings, the pines glistening with morning frost, the silver thread of a stream snaking through the valleys below, the hush that fell over them each time the wind died down. Silas occasionally pointed out a landmark, a rocky outcrop shaped like an eagle's head, the charred remains of a tree likely struck by lightning, but otherwise they rode in companionable silence. On the first night they made camp in a shallow ravine, shielded from the wind. Silas expertly constructed a small fire ring with stones, coaxed a flame from tinder, and heated a pot of coffee. Under a canopy of stars, they shared a sparse meal of dried jerky and biscuits Margaret had packed. When she shivered from the chill, he quietly draped a woolen blanket across her shoulders, an unspoken gesture of solidarity. Margaret found her thoughts drifting to how much had changed in just a few weeks. She was no longer simply a grieving widow, powerless against the whims of her late husband's family. She was a mother determined to keep her children safe. And more startlingly, she was a woman who felt the stirrings of trust, and maybe something deeper, for a man she had only recently met. Did Silas sense it too, this current of warmth beneath their hardships? She caught herself watching the shape of his hands scarred and calloused as they toyed with the handle of the coffee pot. She studied the faint lines around his eyes when he glanced at her across the fire. He seemed so sure, so steady, even when he had every reason to keep distant. Her musings were cut short by the reminder of the hearing looming like a dark cloud. If the judge ruled in Zachary's favor, the boys might be placed in their uncle's custody. The thought made her fists clench. She reminded herself of Silas's vow. We won't let them take you. Perhaps that was just the brand of quiet courage she needed. Early the next morning, they packed up camp and continued arriving in Willcrest by midday. The site of the courthouse, a two-story brick structure with a wooden sign out front, sent an anxious thrill through Margaret. She'd never been inside such a place. The idea of standing before a judge enumerating her reasons for being a fit mother felt both humiliating and intimidating. Silas rode close, leaning over slightly to murmur, "We'll see the clerk first, get the papers sorted." She nodded, her throat tight. They tethered their horses and stepped inside, bracing for the confrontation that would decide not just her future, but that of her beloved boys. The air inside the courthouse lobby was stuffy, smelling faintly of ink tobacco, and the sweat of too many bodies in a confined space. Margaret and Silas presented their summons to a clerk, who directed them to a small hearing room on the second floor. Her heart pounded with each step of the creaking staircase, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Would Zachary be here? What lies would he spin? Could she prove that the children were well cared for, especially given that the ranch was technically Silas's property and not her own? When they reached the hearing room, a cramped space furnished with a bench for the judge and a few rows of chairs, Margaret scanned the faces. She recognized none of them. Zachary wasn't present. Instead, he had sent a lawyer, a smug man in a dark suit, who gave Margaret the briefest of glances before focusing on the judge. A gray-haired gentleman named Judge Atkins. The proceedings began with the lawyer presenting the facts as laid out by the Whitaker family, that Margaret was an impoverished widow, possibly unstable, who had made off with the children under suspicious circumstances. There was talk of protecting the best interests of the minors and ensuring they aren't exposed to the dangers of a remote, unregulated environment. The language was polished, the tone dripping with condescension. Margaret's hands trembled, but she held her chin up. The judge, stone-faced, then turned to her. "Is it true, Mrs. Whitaker, that you left your husband's home with no formal property agreement and no stable income?" he asked. She took a breath. "My husband died unexpectedly," she began. "His brother claimed everything, including documents and the house. I had no safe place to go. The only source of shelter we found was Mr. Redwood's ranch, where my children have been warm-fed, and—" her voice wavered. "Loved," the lawyer sniffed, glancing at his notes. "That's well and good. But do you have any proof of your late husband's wishes? Any legal will or testament? My clients maintain that you were not in your right mind." Silence followed as Margaret tried to steady her trembling. "I do not have the will," she admitted, "because it's in Zachary Whitaker's possession, hidden away. She paused, realizing her anger was flaring, and forced a calmer tone. "He forced me out, threatened to say I was unfit, and I lacked the money or counsel to fight him." Judge Atkins turned to Silas. "And who are you to this family, sir?" Silas stood, shoulders set. "I'm Silas Redwood. I served in the Union Army years ago and have run my family ranch ever since Mrs. Whitaker and her children were found nearly freezing on a mountain road. They've been under my protection since that day. I'm prepared to speak on her behalf. The children aren't in danger unless someone tries to rip them away from their mother." Margaret's eyes prickled with tears, but she held them back. There was a murmuring in the small crowd of onlookers. The judge cleared his throat and asked a series of questions about the conditions at Silas's ranch, about the children's schooling, clothing, and future prospects. Margaret answered truthfully each time, with Silas adding his own observations of how the boys were thriving. The judge listened intently, flipping through documents, pausing now and then to frown at the lawyer's repeated insinuations. As the hearing wore on, Margaret felt a growing surge of determination. "I refuse to let Zachary's lies steal my children," she thought. When at last the judge set his papers aside, Margaret realized she'd been holding her breath for what felt like an hour. A hush fell over the room as Judge Atkins steepled his fingers. His weathered face betrayed a fatigue that came from years of hearing bitter disputes. "It is the opinion of this court," he began, "that stable and loving care is paramount. While we have no absolute proof of the late Arthur Whitaker's will, the evidence presented suggests that his brother has withheld critical documentation. I find no credible reason to declare Mrs. Whitaker mentally unfit or incompetent. As for the children's best interests, they appear to be safe and provided for under her care at Mr. Redwood's ranch. Margaret's pulse hammered relief breaking like sunshine through a storm. Silas's hand tightened on the back of her chair, a small but supportive gesture. The judge turned to pages in front of him, continuing in a level tone. Therefore, custody of Thomas Whitaker and Andrew Whitaker shall remain with their mother, Margaret Whitaker. Furthermore, Mr. Redwood may continue in a supportive guardianship role should both parties agree to provide additional security. The lawyer sputtered, stepping forward to protest, but the judge cut him off with a sharp rap of the gavel. The Whitaker family may appeal if they gather legitimate documentation of wrongdoing, but this hearing is concluded. His glare implied that he found the lawyer's arguments lacking. Margaret felt dizzy from the sheer wave of relief. She clasped Silas's hand almost without realizing it. He gave hers a reassuring squeeze. In that moment, the world seemed to tilt as if telling her that they might actually have a future free of Zachary's looming shadow. When they left the courthouse, the winter sun was blinding off the snow. Margaret's eyes brimmed with tears of joy, the tension of weeks unwinding. At last, Silas turned to her, expression unreadable for a moment, then softened. "You did it," he said. She shook her head. "We did it." Before she could overthink her impulse, she rose on her toes and pressed a light trembling kiss to his cheek. It was a brief gesture, one that left them both a bit startled, but neither pulled away. "Thank you," she whispered. "Voice catching for standing with me." They rode out of Willcrest that same afternoon, eager to reunite with the boys. On the journey back, Margaret's heart felt startlingly light. She imagined the expression on Thomas's face when she told him they were safe, that no one could take him and Andrew away. She pictured Andrew's grin when he realized they could go back to gathering eggs with Silas in the barn, rummaging through the small library by the firelight, and playing in the yard without fear of official knocks at the door. In the midst of her daydream, she glanced over at Silas, who was guiding Tucker around a fallen branch in the trail. His profile, outlined by the waning afternoon sun, carried a steadiness that comforted her more than any law or decree could. "He's done more than just protect me," she thought. "He's reminded me that good men exist, that the world can offer second chances." Their arrival at Mrs. Mallory's place was met with squeals of delight from Andrew and a proud, relieved smile from Thomas. The boys ran to Margaret, hugging her and bombarding her with questions. Silas dismounted slowly, patted his horse, and stood aside, letting them have their moment. Margaret felt her eyes mist again, but this time her tears were filled with gratitude and hope. They returned to the ranch by nightfall, the quiet hum of domestic life swallowing them in warmth, a crackling fire in the hearth, the smell of fresh cornbread. Margaret set to bake, the sense that this house was no longer just Silas Redwood's solitary domain, but a shared refuge where each occupant mattered. It felt like home, a word Margaret had not dared to use in a long, long time. From a personal perspective, I find this story a testament to how courage and compassion can bloom in the harshest conditions. Margaret's unwavering love for her sons, despite being stripped of almost everything, is both inspiring and profound. And Silas's readiness to offer shelter and ultimately his partnership reminds us that second chances can appear when we least expect them. Their triumph in court, grounded in honest testimonies and steadfast resolve, shows that goodness prevails when we stand for what is right. I hope this ending brought a sense of hope and renewed faith in the power of kindness. What do you think of Margaret's journey and Silas's quiet heroism? Please share your opinions in the comments below. It's through conversation and diverse viewpoints that these stories truly come alive. Let's keep the discussion going and continue to celebrate the resilience of the human spirit.